He was alone in his house when the light came. It did not shiver like a television glow or the blunt sweep of a police cruiser. It pooled in the corner of his living room like a remembered ocean, pale and slow, as if the air itself had decided to breathe blue. Dennis Reeves, who had spent 40 years reading stones and arguing with comfortable professors, watched it and felt, for the first time in a long time, the unheralded lift of possibility. Dennis had been a man defined by two stubborn things: an obsession with the monuments that rose out of the desert and the long, bitter aftertaste of being dismissed. He had trained like a scholar, given lectures, dug in neat squares of sand, and written papers with careful footnotes. But his papers carried a single line that would color everything else. Pyramids were not, in his view, merely tombs. He had said it softly at first, then louder. The idea cost him tenure, invitations, and the easy smiles of colleagues. He lost funded digs, and for years the invitations to peer panels arrived with polite avoidance. They told him he had wasted his life chasing a dream built on flimsy speculation. They told him the stones belonged to funerary cults and mortuary art, to well-understood eras and firmly mapped dynasties. He kept saying one thing that made people lean away from him. Look at the geometry. Look at the alignments. There is far more here than burial. He had not expected vindication. He had expected, at most, to die convinced but ignored. He had not been prepared for a light that would show him otherwise. The evening the visitor arrived, the house smelled of lemon oil and old paper. Dennis had moved through rooms of collected books like a man checking his life for holes. His bones ached from long seasons in the field. His hearing preferred the quiet of marginalia to the boom of a crowded lecture hall. There were faded photographs of his younger self on digs, hair long, eyes bright with the kind of confidence that losses had worn down but not erased. The television had been left on low to warm the silence. The light did not come from a screen. It simply began, a breathing pool, and from it came the voice. Not words at first, but a pressure at the edge of thought, a clarity like someone tapping a glass, and then a sentence formed in his head as clearly as if a companion had spoken into his ear. He did not hear, he received. "We observe," it said, "we document." There was no accent to the thought. It was neither male nor female. It was the kind of voice that refused metaphor and made metaphors unnecessary, efficient, curious, older than the desert itself. Dennis felt his heart race, a scholar's measured terror. He had read the thin books, seen the late-night interviews where other witnesses spoke of impossible things, of lights and presences and conversations in the shape of impressions. He had mocked some of them in the past, the way a man who has loved a method must sometimes excise romance. Yet here, with the light at his corner and the voice framing itself within his skull, he felt something ancestral reawaken. The peculiar hunger that had sent him into heat and dust decades ago. Validate my papers, he thought, not as a demand, but as a small, private plea. You sought understanding, the voice replied. We will show you. The voice was not the thing. The light was not the medium. This was an invitation, shaped like research rather than revelation. The alien, for lack of better language, the word rose and fell in Dennis's mind like a stone into a deep well, did not push itself into his life. It offered a projection, a non-physical journey through layers of a land Dennis had studied all his life. See 3 eras, the thought suggested, and understand. Dennis had not planned this. He stood with his fist closed around a book spine until the edges of the cover imprinted the calluses of his thumb. He remembered, with a sharp and painful sweetness, the laughter of former colleagues at a conference the year he had first proposed his thesis. He remembered friends lost to the polite exile of scholarly debate. He remembered, with a scholar's detail, the king's names etched in a trench and the faint, stubborn geometry that refused to line up with comfortable narratives. All those things coalesced now into a single brittle hunger. He nodded, though there was no one to see the motion, and the room changed. The house dissolved into a sky the color of old bronze, and then into sand and wind. The telepathic voice ceased to be a contact and began to be a program of light. Dennis felt himself unmoored from the familiar weight of his body. It was not violent, not cinematic, but like standing up after a long illness and finding the legs lighter than expected. He was not traveling with instruments. This was perception shifting, a projection into carefully curated memory. "Observe," the alien said, this time in a line that arrived as if an instructor were pointing out detail in a painting. "We record function, not only form." He floated above a sprawling construction scene. The Great Pyramid, not yet weathered to the ochre of modern photos, but sharp with tool marks and alive with intention, rose under a sky that seemed tuned to deep blue. Workers moved with seamless coordination, but they were not the tired laborers of modern documentaries. They were initiates, engineers, carriers of knowledge. They set great slabs of stone into position without the noisy choreography of cranes. Stones hummed as they floated, aligning like magnets to an invisible lattice. Crystalline devices glinted in the palms of technicians. Their hands did not grasp, but aligned frequency. It was levitation, perhaps, in the language of myth, but the sense Dennis carried from the vision was of precise calibration rather than brute force. "This is preservation," the alien shared, a concise mathematical thought blooming in Dennis's chest. Stone as archive, stone as resonator. Dennis had always imagined the stones as stubborn witnesses. He had not expected to feel them as living instruments, like enormous tuning forks set into the planet's grid. In the projection, he could see the capstone catch the sun and translate it into a slow internal pulse, a bass note that moved through bones and water. Workers tuned the angles. They sang, but what seemed like song to an outsider was pattern to a practitioner, a modulation of frequency that matched the pulse of the stones. The number 432 came into Dennis's mind, not as an algebraic claim, but as a tone the vision accentuated, an old frequency that the builders used to align internal and external fields. The alien's next input arrived in a fold of compassion. "We cannot prove this to those who rely solely on instruments of matter," it said. "They will not hear the hum. They will feel only the stones." But for the living, it formed maps. Dennis's scholar brain wanted to protest proof, evidence, testable hypotheses. He could hear the thin, worried voice of his old self, the one who had learned footnotes before faith. And yet the projection rendered the scholar's objections as brittle as bones dried in the sun. The structure of intention here was not about burying rulers. It was about leaving functioning architecture for a species meant to remember itself across epochs. As they moved, the scene shifted from open construction to the intimate hush inside a corridor. The walls seemed to breathe. Torches were unnecessary. Low-frequency light, like the blue that had appeared in his living room, answered a different kind of human eye. Dennis felt the air change in texture. It tasted found, like spring water after long thirst. They slid into a chamber the size of a cathedral nave, and in its center rested a sarcophagus. Not ornate in the way of funerary art, but pure and machine-like. Its lid inscribed with geometry rather than hieroglyphs. A figure lay within, calm and composed, and the surrounding circle of initiates chanted in a pattern that Dennis realized he could understand not by language but by resonance. The voice in his head offered an interpretation. Activation, the alien said, not burial, a passage. Dennis had written sentences like that in rejected grant applications, arguing for purpose in design.
Now he was watching purpose enacted. The sarcophagus as womb, not coffin. The ritual less about closing and more about opening. The initiate's chest did not heave with breath. Instead, a subtle coil of light began at their spine and rose toward the skull. A slow, luminous ascent that threaded through the vertebrae like light pouring into an old lamp. Dennis recognized, within his own vocabulary, the term kundalini. He had used that word once in a paper to describe a metaphor. Here, in the alien's projection, it was an event. The figure's face softened.
Cellular light, and when Dennis thought of cells, he saw them as points of starfire rather than biological uniformity, began to reconfigure. He watched tiny cables of light wind into form, and as they did, the whole aura around the body hummed, a harmony that seemed to speak to DNA as much as to spirit. Here the metaphors his colleagues mocked, DNA activation, pineal opening, were not arguments but descriptions of phenomena his eyes watched unfold. It restructures memory, the alien said simply, not erases, restructures. Dennis wanted to be careful with language. He had read about the pineal, the tiny gland at the center of skulls, described by mystics and mockers alike. The vision offered a gentle, graphic unsealing. What to modern thought seemed calcified and sealed, softened like old wax under a new heat. There was no pseudo-scientific flourish in the projection. There was only the image, a small center of crystalline light clarifying, as if a lens had been wiped clean. The initiate's perception widened, their face lit with a tenderness that made Dennis ache. He felt, with the full, embarrassing body of human sympathy, both joy and an old scholar's shame for having once scoffed at the language of such witnesses. Death is a doorway fashioned by intentional architecture, the alien continued. We helped, they refined. You will see why. The scene broadened then, like a lens pulling back. The Nile flowed by, a silver artery. Temples rose like stations on a pilgrimage route, one dedicated to a mother figure of healing, another to the sharp clarity of sight, another to joy in music, and one finally quiet and severe, where theology and physics braided into ceremonies of cessation and return. Dennis walked, or rather his consciousness walked, along the banks, watching priests and practitioners move through rituals that looked, from a distance, like communal therapy. People high with grief and people boastful of power alike came to drink, to be cleansed, to be tuned. The alien offered a line that came without drama, but landed with implication. The Nile functioned as a circulatory system, it said, not purely chemical, energetic. Dennis tried to keep his interpretation tentative, as the voice of reason taught him. The alien's account was a vision, not incontrovertible history. He would later write this, if he wrote, with the conservative caveats of any responsible witness. This is what I saw. Take it as experience, not proof. But the image of the river as an energy conduit, temples placed like nodes of renewal along its banks, fit a pattern he had long felt but never been able to connect. Here, in the projection, priests removed grief like knots and bound it to song. Tears were not meaningless, but moved through circuits that returned them healed. They passed a doorway into a hall where the statues of gods were not idols, but interfaces. A child, perhaps 8, stood before a statue of a female deity and pressed their small hand to the stone, eyes wide. The statue answered with a vibration, a slight warmth that traveled up the child's arm. Dennis felt the sound of the child's intake, which was curiosity, not fear. Initiation begins early, the alien noted, designed to integrate, not to isolate. Dennis watched, and an ache of recognition caught him. He had been 30 when he first walked beside the monuments at night, imagining their meaning. He had never imagined the possibility that initiation was not reserved for the powerful and the kingly. He had written papers arguing social structures, but here the vision offered a radically inclusive anatomy.
systems that worked on many levels, accessible to those who sought them in attunement rather than entitlement. Why would this be hidden? Dennis asked inwardly, because the thought knotted flowers into his chest. Why would such a system, so benevolent in design, fall into silence? The voice answered with a care he did not expect. Preservation requires filters. Time corroded use. Fear and greed masked function. Yet some knowledge remained sealed, waiting for a threshold in consciousness that would make opening safe. The idea of a threshold was both comforting and arresting. It explained why sights could be both potent and dangerous in the hands of the uninitiated. It explained why a structure built for the soul could be misread as a monument to death. Dennis felt anger, a scholar's righteous disappointment. But the alien sentences softened it into something like patience. Power does not need secrecy to be sacred, the voice said. Secrecy is a tool of preservation, not always a sign of malice. Dennis took this image into himself. Seal as safety, not merely as conspiracy. It was a nuanced map of preservation rather than accusation, and it soothed the old mocking parts of him that had felt betrayed by academic exile. This was not about him. It was about thresholds and about timing. The projection suggested that humanity had been, at times, entrusted with instruments that required a certain maturity to wield. They moved then to an area near the Sphinx. Dennis had spent a lifetime parsing the carved face against the wind and moon of Egypt. Here, the Sphinx's face watched not as a solitary monument, but as the lid of an archive. A sealed chamber, its doors invisible to those who had not been shown. Beneath its paw, a chamber hummed faintly, sealed by frequency patterns that only opened when human consciousness harmonized with them. Dennis felt the precise weirdness of this revelation slide along his skin like cold water. Records, the alien said, pre-flood preserved. Not for all, for those who could read without destroying. He saw, in the projection, tidy cylinders of crystalline records, scrolls of light, coiled and strapped like sleeping beasts.
The records did not lay out linear history as his textbooks taught. They were more like condensed essences, maps, therapies, warnings. The alien did not claim these were irrefutable archives. This is how it appeared to us, it said. Interpretation follows sight. Dennis thought of the academic hearings that had removed his funding. He pictured committee tables, polite smiles, and the silence that followed his claim. He felt again the dull, private grief of being silenced. Yet here, the revelation offered a different path forward. He could continue to be a man of marginal notes and closed doors, or he could become something else. Witness to vision, translator of sensory testimony, carrier of a story that did not fit in peer-reviewed journals, but might fit, somehow, into human awakening. The projection paused at a point that made the old speculative parts of his mind tingle. There was a seal, a frequency-based shackle across the Sphinx chamber. Dennis could feel it resonating at a pitch he could almost recall from childhood afternoons listening to a tuning fork in an old physics lab. The alien's thought stepped into a rhythm of warning and patience. It will open, it said, when many hearts hold the note. For now, it waits. Dennis had always, even at his angriest moments, believed that time and tides worked differently with ideas. He had hoped for validation too late for himself, but early enough for others. That the chamber waited for a threshold felt like an invitation rather than a denial. It promised eventual democratization, a slow dissolution of gatekeepers, a movement from curated secrecy to shared awakening. It gave him, in that suspended second, a future story, not the vindication of one man, but the possibility of a people waking. Yet the vision was not all grand design. It also carried for Dennis the terrors and confusions of human frailty. He saw an initiate, in a different time, who had touched a device without proper attunement. Light overwhelmed them, and the scene collapsed into a rush of memory bleed, an effect the alien framed as a kind of information overload the unprepared could not integrate. Dennis felt compassion doubling into fear. Knowledge preserved in stone could be both blessing and burden. He understood the caution now. Some things, when uncontained, rippled and harmed. He felt culpable for his earlier hubris, in which he had wanted to drag knowledge into the daylight without the lining of readiness. The projection had not only vindicated his central suspicion, it had also humbled him with the obviousness of his own arrogance. They moved, then, toward the heart of the system, where the initiations climbed to their summit. Dennis knew a narrative beat was approaching, a line the alien had promised. What happens after death? Up until now, he had seen the architecture and the procession, a system of tuning and healing, but he had not been prepared for the intimacy of the answer the projection set before him. Death, the alien said, is not an end, but a recalibration. The sarcophagus is not a prison, it is a chrysalis. Dennis felt that sentence inside him like a wedge. It was not a comforting metaphor, but a clinical reframing. He had always imagined death as a door, but the projection insisted it be seen as a process of reordering. Cells as letters, DNA as punctuation, the self as a syntax, rearranged to suit new chapters. He watched sequences of people enter the sarcophagus not in panic, but in pilgrimage. They surrendered weight and opened into broader perception. Some returned to mortal life afterward, changed with a new mission. Others continued into cycles that the alien described briskly as re-embodiment, functionally similar to what many called reincarnation. Dennis had not believed in carriages of souls. He had not been comfortable with the tidy metaphors of reincarnation. Yet the projection was not tidy in a sentimental way. It was a mechanism. The sarcophagus hummed with a tone that unfastened fear and rewove memory. There was grief in this, because it implied loss of prior selves in service of evolution. And there was immense relief, because it rewired death as an instructive passage rather than a final verdict. As Dennis absorbed the projection, a brief, sharp line of doubt pierced him. This was extraordinary, he thought, a vision that explained mysteries in a language part physics, part ritual, part music. How could any of this be reconciled with the cautious, metric world that had expelled him? He felt the old default of skepticism rising like a protective animal. Testability, evidence, falsifiability. The alien anticipated this, as if it had catalogued human doubt as another archive. This is shown to you, it said with a precise gentleness, as experience, not proof, not a paper with footnotes. If you wish, you may verify pieces in time. We do not replace method. We present a map. Dennis took that as permission and as a new kind of responsibility. He was a man who had loved method. Something in him still did. But now so utterly retooled by what he had witnessed that method alone seemed an insufficient frame. The projection had opened a path that required both evidence and empathy, notes and breath. They retreated then from the luminous inner sanctum to the cooling air of the banks, where modern visitors, weary tourists and seekers alike, touched stones and felt, occasionally, the tug of a system whose wires were frayed but alive. Dennis watched a small man press his forehead to a stone and weep with a kind of liberation that had nothing to do with faith statements. A woman with a foreign accent left the temple transformed, clutching a small vial of Nile water that, in the projection, glowed faintly. The alien's commentary stayed clinical. Partial activations occur. Sensitivity varies. Some experiences are ephemeral, others lasting. Dennis understood what that meant in a painful and human way. Not everyone would get the sarcophagus. Not everyone would be given the clearing of the pineal or the reshaping of DNA patterns as the vision showed. Some would touch the river and breathe differently for a day and then fall back. Some would be remade. The system was not a machine with uniform output, but an ecosystem of opportunity, filtered by species maturity and personal readiness. The alien did not promise cures, it presented probability. The projection began to dim, the way a theater light eases off. Dennis felt the weight of his own living room press back into his limbs, and his heart, which had been a drum of eager terror, found its beat again. The alien left him a thought before the blue receded. Return, it said. Interpret, share with caution. Dennis came awake to the lemoned air and the thin television glow. He sat with his hands braced on his knees, feeling as if he had been underwater and had just surfaced, gasping with a single, large lungful of truth. His body smelled of dust and the ocean of old books. For a moment he could not tell whether he'd been dreaming the voice or whether the voice had been a projection of his own lonely, desperate scholarship. He reached for a notebook and began to write, not with the clinical pensiveness of his earlier career, but with hands that shook. His sentences were shorter now, urgent, trying to pin down an experience that by design resisted finalization. He wrote, "I saw the stones hum. I saw the sarcophagus like a womb. I saw the Nile as circuitry." He knew the words were inadequate, but they anchored him. The next morning, Dennis sat beneath a shabby lamp and read what he had written. He felt like a man who had been given a book and was ordered to teach from memory. He was no longer purely the embittered scholar. Something had cracked open. The vision had not only answered the question of what happens after death, it had also left him unprepared in precisely the way the title of this story promised. He had not been made ready for the moral weight of translating what he'd seen into the language of living people. If this kind of story intrigues you, subscribe and stay with me, there is more to come. He told no one that day. He walked through the city with the notebooks nested in his jacket like contraband. He reread his own paragraphs and winced at their rawness. The academic part of him cataloged problems. How to avoid being labeled a fabulist. How to protect whatever integrity he could claim. The human part, the part that had cradled spectacles of lonely desert nights, recognized that this was no single career vindication. It was a summons. The projection had left a map and a longing. It had shown systems that wound through the land like secret rivers of function.
It had intimated that death was continuity, that stone could hold memory, that consciousness might be a weaver moving from life to life with the assistance of architecture and water and tone. Yet it had given him no easy way to prove any of it to those who had once dismissed him without listening. For the next weeks, Dennis lived in a peculiar double life. By day, he tutored a few students, wrote curt letters to journals, and ordered coffee at the same little cart on the corner where he had always ordered it. At night, he arranged his thoughts as if they were seeds to be planted. He also reread sections of his old work, looking for the seam between legend and science. He collected quotes from physicists and poets with the same attention, trying to braid them into a vocabulary that would not make the stones laugh. He began, tentatively, to tell a select few. He did not use the word alien at first. He spoke of an observer or a presence, because part of him still protected his professional dignity. But the experience had shifted something else. It made him less afraid to be odd. He found himself, unexpectedly, listening more than speaking. He became patient in a new way, as if the vision had remolded the contours of his temper. When a young woman told him that she had been to a temple and felt changed for a day, he did not mock. He asked what she had tasted, what the light had felt like on her skin. He practiced, in small ways, the humility the alien had modeled in its brief, crisp sentences. And yet there was a nagging worry. If the projection was to be more than the private consolations of a lonely man, it needed translation that did not betray either the vision or the method. Dennis felt the old academic protocols like a harness on a wild animal he was now trying to coax into being useful without breaking its spirit. One evening, as autumn hinted in the air, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find a woman he had not seen before. Dark hair knotted to a single practical twist, eyes that held both skepticism and the fatigue of someone who had listened for years and heard little. She introduced herself as Mara. She said, simply, "I heard you speak once at a small symposium about the function of monuments. I didn't agree with you, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I came because of the way you described threshold." Dennis was startled by her candor. Guests had not been a common occurrence in his late life of lecturing and retreat. He felt the exhilaration of a scholar whose work had finally attracted attention. But Mara's attention came with no special pleading for proof. She did not ask to be shown a map. She asked, instead, to learn what it felt like to touch the stone without breaking oneself. Dennis found himself speaking, carefully. He did not deliver the projection as a set of facts. He told her, instead, that he had had an experience. He described the light in the corner of his living room, the projection of construction scenes, and the sarcophagus like a womb. He emphasized again and again that what he offered was witness, not evidence. Mara listened without interruption, and when he finally closed his mouth, she sat for a moment in the hush between them, like someone counting coins. "I have had visits to ruins that left me altered," she said, "not because I wanted them, but because they asked something of me. If your story is true, or even if it is only true to you, then there are people who will be harmed and people who will be healed. We need a way to be careful." Dennis felt a strike of gratitude like light in his sternum. Whoever the alien was, whoever recorded things and preserved pattern, it had left him not only with images, but with moral questions. It had made him, suddenly, a steward of testimony. The projection had been private. The stewardship, he now realized, would require community. This small and marked evening planted in Dennis a new agenda. He began to meet, quietly, with a handful of people. Mara, a retired sound engineer who believed deeply in the power of tone, a nurse who had spent long nights helping dying people breathe with dignity, and a young artist who had learned to read old symbols and loved to translate the silence of stone into paint. They met in his living room, the same room where the light had first pooled. They read the notes Dennis had scribbled the night of the projection and listened to each other's half-formed theories without leaping to shaming certainties. None of them claimed to hold truth. They agreed only on method, careful observation, respect for what might be more than they were, and a kind of democratic humility. They tried, in small, reverent ways, to recreate an ethic of pilgrimage that did not commodify the sacred. They argued about whether a guided visit to a temple could be done responsibly. They debated whether anyone should touch the stones at all. They wrote down rules, then crossed them out. The project did not have a clear name, and that was part of its integrity. It felt like an act of repair. Through these small gatherings, Dennis felt the edges of his old bitterness soften. The alien had shown him what happens after death. The larger, more pressing question now was what happened to people after they saw those images in the living world. How would a community steward such experiences without turning them into spectacle? How would one teach people to approach a sarcophagus as a womb and not as a novelty? He wrote to one colleague, a younger archaeologist who had once been a sympathizer in private, and asked if she would accompany him the following season to Egypt. She replied with a cautious yes. It felt like a small victory, not headline-making, not vindication for his career, but the modest convening of like minds. And yet, even as he planned this tentative pilgrimage, the projection's most intimate image hovered like a tether around his throat. His own body inside the sarcophagus. In the vision, he had stood outside and watched others enter. He had not been prepared to go himself. The alien had promised a guided tour. It had not promised that he would participate. The thought of lying within that machine womb, of letting internal coils unwind and the pith of self rearrange into something else, filled him with tasteful terror. But the projection had also left him with a hunger. He had always craved understanding. He had always desired not approval, but insight. That night in his living room, he had felt the pulse of a possibility that answered the question of what happens after death with a clarity that erased simple fear. Death was a recalibration, a re-education, a passage that returned a traveler to new tasks. Yet the mechanics and the ethics of that passage, who earned the right to enter, who must wait, how the seals were balanced, remained unresolved. He had been unprepared for the weight of translating such visions into living ethics. The next time the light came, he did not flinch. He sat upright and opened the book in his lap. The alien did not appear immediately. The living room remained still. Dennis felt, in that patient hour, the odd peace of a man who had been given a map and realized he would have to learn the terrain. He had been shown what happens after death. He understood now that he was not merely a receiver of truth, but a steward of testimony. And that stewardship would require quiet courage, careful community, and a willingness to be unprepared. He learned to wait without flinching. The blue that had once pooled in his living room arrived less like a surprise and more like an appointment, patient, precise, and without theatrics. When it touched the bookshelf again, Dennis closed his eyes and let the room thin. He kept one hand on the paperbacks by habit to remember that the life he had built of footnotes and measured sentences still held him. The alien, the observer that had offered the projection, did not appear as a creature with a face, but as an insistence in thought, short, exact, devoid of flourish. "Ready," it said. Dennis exhaled. The words settled through him like a ledger balance being made right. He had spent months preparing in ways he could tolerate. Not rituals, which the projection had warned against presenting as instruction, but practical things, logistical notes for travel, a list of people he trusted, conversations with Mara about ethics and harm reduction. He had wrestled with the old scholar's compulsion to make everything examinable. He had also accepted, with a new humility, that some knowledge required the patient alchemy of living encounter rather than laboratory proof. He had put one foot into that liminal space and found the sensation of it curious as stepping from sand into cool water. The projection took him not straight to the inner sanctum this time, but through what felt like a rehearsal. He watched small rituals of welcome that had been practiced for centuries. Not theatrical recreations for tourists, but real acts of preparation. Offerings of song, tones held until the stones relaxed, water poured in measured ways. There were no incantations as he had feared, only careful calibrations of intention. The presence that guided him imparted a line of practical meaning as they moved. Not all who enter should, it said. Not all must. Discretion is part of care. Dennis had argued that before, in moralizing tones. Now he felt the ethics in his bone marrow. The living room dissolved, and he was on a plane of light that arced toward the Nile. This time, when the stone rose around him, he was not a foreigner reading a text, but a student with a small devoted cohort. Mara, the sound engineer named Elias, who carried a battered tuner in his satchel, the nurse, Lena, who had learned to attend dying people with humility, and the artist, Noah, who could walk canals of silence into drawing. There was also a younger archaeologist, Hannah, whose cautious curiosity had once been private and now had consented to travel. Each of them had seen small things in their lives that made Dennis's tale plausible. Each had agreed, explicitly, that they would approach with humility and leave judgment to experience. When they arrived in Egypt in the dry light of a dawn that smelled of stone and sun-warmed dust, Dennis felt a peripheral shock. The monuments were both more ordinary than any photo had taught him, and more alive than his old lens accounted. For a scholar, for all the late-night fantasies of vindication, the first real touch of a pyramid carried a quiet domesticity.
The planes of stone fit together like a patient lock. Weathered edges carried fingerprints of wind rather than the finality of death. The group moved slowly, not as tourists, but as people trying not to disturb a sleeping instrument. They met custodians, not caricatures of secrecy, but careful stewards who had inherited practices and paperwork, routines and suspicion. Dennis had spent a lifetime imagining conspiracies of doom. He encountered instead a tapestry of human interests. Families whose livelihood depended on tourism, elders who remembered old rituals in half-phrases, archivists who protected caches because they understood harm as well as benefit. It had never been one monolith. Some kept secrets to hoard power, some to guard against misuse. Dennis found this nuance both morally complicated and necessary. He learned to listen without quick verdicts. The first visits were small and slow. Mara stayed with the inscriptions and the flow of narrative memory, asking people about funerary tales and about songs.
Elias sat and listened to stones, placing a tuning fork at angles Dennis could not have imagined, and told them when a wall vibrated faintly at a certain pitch, a pitch that in the projection had been rendered as 432, not as a slogan, but as a tone within a system. Lena watched visitors after ceremonies, not to catalog miracles, but to note behavior changes, the small ways anxiety loosened for some and tightened for others. Noah drew. Hannah recorded measurements in a way that would be defensible later, if defensibility mattered. Dennis held his notes as if they were bulbs to be planted. He did not broadcast claims. He kept the projection's hum in the quiet part of him, a thing not to be sold, but to be stewarded. He witnessed partial activations, a man who had wandered into a temple and left with a new patience, an old woman who pressed her palm to the wall and later reported she could remember a child's face she had never known. Small miracles and small griefs threaded the days. The group learned to follow an ethic they could articulate simply. Respect the site, respect the person, prioritize integration over spectacle. And yet, as predicted by the projection, some encounters were disorienting. Dennis watched a visitor, excited and unmoored, come out of a chamber, pale and shaking, muttering about lives and names. Lena tended to these people like a nurse to a shock patient. Water, grounding, talk to anchor memory to the present. Noah sketched as a way of pulling experience down into form. Sketches, Dennis discovered, acted like translating the dream language of stone into the communal grammar of paper and ink. Hannah provided baseline readings when warranted, clinical in tone but human in care. They built protocols that were more about listening than about power. It felt like building a small culture. The group was invited, cautiously, into the slope-priested corridors of a lesser-known complex that, in the projection, served as a kind of training ground for initiation. The custodians who permitted them stressed one line again and again: thresholds matter. There were practical reasons, preservation, safety, but also moral ones. The elders who allowed them in did so with quiet ceremonies of consent. A drink of water, a song, an exchange of names. They did not promise results, they promised care. Dennis had rehearsed mentally for the sarcophagus. He had not, however, rehearsed the particular hunger that flared when the room's door sealed and the air itself deepened in color. The sarcophagus in that complex was smaller than the Great Pyramid's legendary box in the projection. Yet its proportions felt calibrated to a human spine, to a particular vertebral arc. When he lay down, he did so with all the self-awareness of a man who had spent a life studying posture and tool marks. He understood alignment the way someone understands grammar, as a scaffold of meaning. The lid of the sarcophagus did not clang shut like a Hollywood coffin. It met the stone like two palms in prayer. Elias placed a small tuning fork nearby, not as a ritual but as a sympathetic note, and he touched hand to wall and closed his eyes. Mara hummed an old folk phrase she had learned from an archive. Lena monitored Dennis for pulse and breathing and did not leave his side. Hannah recorded. Noah held a small sketch pad like a prayer. The circle felt like a laboratory where consent and compassion were the instruments of measurement. When the chamber sat around him like an animal holding its breath, the alien's presence arrived as clarity once more. "You were unprepared the first time," it said. "This is not about readiness as gatekeeping. This is about honest threshold." Dennis thought then, in a startled internal voice, of all the ways he had been unready. The arrogance of certainty, the fury of dismissal, the lonely ache that had become a career. He thought of the colleagues who had smiled politely while closing doors. He thought of how teaching young scholars to be cautious had sometimes hardened into cowardice, and how courage had to be redefined as humility. The sarcophagus began its work not with showy transformations, but with small rearrangements of attention. Dennis felt a sensation at the base of his spine, as if an old string were being rewound. It was not pain, but a peculiar pressure, a schooling of the nervous system into a new sequence. Images unfurled in the dark like latched pages. A room of crystalline records, a child touching stone, a river moving memory away like leaves. The alien guided, concise and patient. "Drop weight," it said. He did. Not because he could choose it in a volitional way, but because the environment itself made the choice seem less frightening than his old tether to identity. The coils of image and memory rose, and with them a cascade of sensation. Colors tasted like metal warmed by sun. Grief folded into a pattern that made sense as a chapter. Faces at once strangers and familiar. A steel clarity cut through the fog of his old resentments. He saw ancestors, not as genealogical lists, but as functioned presences. Teachers who had, in some incarnations, tended water. In others, guided songs. In others, written in quiet. They were not dramatic. They were steady, like roots. He felt the pineal as the projection had shown it. A small crystal lens at the center of perception wiping itself clean. Sensory bandwidth expanded. He perceived the architecture of the temple as a living network. Stones not merely bearing message, but routing it. Nodes in a planetary circuit. In this state, the boundaries of the self thinned. He could feel with a clarity that made his chest ache that consciousness persisted as pattern rather than property. Death, the term always seemed too blunt, appeared instead as an editing of a manuscript, a redaction, and then an addition. Scenes moved fast and then slow. A classroom of initiates under a sky that vibrated like a struck bell. A woman kneeling by water and offering her grief. A child opening their small hand to the belly of a statue and receiving a note like a seed. Dennis felt within him the knowledge that such openings were not arbitrary miracles, but folded outcomes of a system that people had once learned to read and then had to forget for safety. There was, in these perceptions, both historical sorrow and consolation. Time was layered, not linear. He saw an earlier era where the Anunnaki, teachers in this visualization, worked with human architects to design the resonant structures. He saw a Middle Age where initiation became ritualized and thus accessible to few. He saw the present, a patchwork of active circuits and frayed nodes. At a certain apex, the individual sense of I dissolved into an experience like standing at the center of a web and feeling each strand vibrate in sympathy with passing life on a distant edge. He did not become nothing. He became, if the words could bear it, a node. The alien's voice returned then, not to give data, but to translate. Consciousness persists, it said. It moves through configurations. Architecture assists transition. Intention shapes return. A cascade of understanding washed through him, that death as transition was less about punishment or gift and more about functional redirection. A soul, such a clumsy human word, could carry tendencies, lessons, and tasks. The sarcophagus, as the vision had first shown him, rearranged more than matter. It ordered purpose.
In that ordering, he felt both sorrow for losses and relief for continuities. He saw, in a sequence tender as a memory of a mother's hands, that those who returned often came back with narrower tasks and softer hearts. When he felt his ego dissolve, there was grief, brief and honest, a regret of having been small in ways that had hurt others. But alongside grief was a clarity, the sense that personal vindication was trivial compared to the work that might follow. He glimpsed lives he had not known were his, a man who had smoothed a temple threshold in the aftermath of flood, and, in the act, preserved a note in stone that later allowed a child to read a healing. In one accelerated loop, he saw his own petty academic quarrels in the context of a larger tapestry and felt the childishness of them without self-condemnation. He was held by the sense that remorse could be the seed of reparation, not a prison. The apex collapsed into a return that was not a jolt, but a gentle folding back. He lay in the sarcophagus and felt the stone cool around him like a promise. The lid rose with the soft patience of a tide. He emerged not triumphant, but taut. The first sound he registered was Lena's voice, human and unadorned. "How do you feel?" Dennis had no immediate tidy answer.
He tasted a strange salt behind his eyes, and laughed once. The sound felt like it belonged to two people at once. He thought, very clearly, one sentence that had both humility and mission. I was not prepared. He had expected that line to be his grief. Instead, it had become a hinge. He had not been prepared for the moral weight of instructing others, for the tenderness demanded by those who are changed without wanting it. He had not been prepared for the communal responsibility that would follow, for the necessity of creating structures that could hold soft awakenings without turning them into spectacle. But being unprepared did not mean incapable. It meant he had been gifted an urgency to build stewardship. In the quiet that followed, the alien offered Dennis a final lesson in crisp lines. They came not as a manifesto, but as condensation. 5 central truths the observer compressed from what he had seen. Each arrived like a bell-struck syllable. Consciousness continues. Reality is co-created. Origins are hybrid and instructive. Power resides within, not only without. Evolution is designed as guidance, not punishment. Each sentence landed differently inside him. The first felt like relief. The second like invitation. The third like explanation with the caveat of controversy. Dennis would later add careful framing whenever he published anything about hybrid origins, always noting that this was the projection's interpretation and deeply contested. The fourth felt like empowerment. The fifth felt like a map with a warning. Design was not destiny, and guidance did not equal guarantee. Dennis carried those truths out of the chamber like relics he was not permitted to monetize. He did not shout them as proof. He repeated them in small circles, over tea and within the sober tones of meetings. He wrote them into the margins of his notebooks and argued with their phrasing until the words fit the world without breaking it. Their return to the wider life in Egypt involved a new set of challenges. Journalists sniffing rumors, curious pilgrims asking for shortcuts, local economies pivoting toward commodified sacredness. Dennis found himself navigating an ethical shoal. He refused interviews that would turn the sights into spectacles. He refused to sell a tour that promised enlightenment by whim. He did help, quietly, to create a program that prioritized integration. A small retreat that included counseling, shared meals, rest periods, and artists to help translate experience into language. It was not a temple school, and it was not a church. It was an experiment in communal care designed to prevent harm and allow meaning. People came. Not all of them were transformed. Not all of them wanted transformation. Some were there simply to see. Some left changed in small ways, softer with grief, more patient with themselves. And that was, to Dennis, enough. A few carried deeper changes. Hannah, for example, who had started skeptical, returned home with a patience she had lacked and with dreams of teaching archaeological ethics differently. Elias cataloged frequencies he could measure and turned them into compositions that, to Dennis's surprise, began to circulate quietly in gatherings of musicians who described them as structures that felt like the stones. Noah's drawings began to appear in small exhibitions where people who had never traveled to Egypt could hold the images and allow something to soften. Lena recorded case notes that might, with careful consent and time, form the basis of practices for care in transitional experiences. Dennis wrote too, though differently now. He wrote essays that tried to hold the shape of what he had seen without claiming to prove it. He wrote with restraint. "This is my witness," he would begin, and the preface of caution shielded the content from the hubris that had cost him his career. Over and over he made that only one witness caveat. He was careful, to the point of rigidity, about separating visionary testimony from academic claim. It was a line he insisted others honor. Years passed in a rhythm that felt, to Dennis, both long and condensed. The small community they had built became a pattern, a ring of people who met in different countries to share experiences and to debate ethics. The projections promise that secrecy had sometimes been preservation and not always malfeasance became a lived nuance when they encountered elder custodians who had kept certain rights hidden not to hoard but to protect. In private conversations, these custodians described the difficult calculus of opening knowledge in a world where idealism and commerce collided. Dennis learned respect for such burden-bearing. He cultivated an attitude of listening rather than judgment. He was surprised at how often skepticism proved to be a form of humility. Many of those who had refused to believe in his projections were not merely closed-minded. They were cautious guards against delusion. He made peace with that. He found, gently, that the work of translation required patience with skepticism and not the condescending triumph he had once fantasized about. He also learned to grant the doubtful a kind of generosity. Some things are only meaningful when the person is ready to accept them, and that readiness cannot be judged by spectacle. On a second, quieter visit to the Sphinx's precinct, Dennis and a small party were led by a woman whose lineage tied her to temple stewardship. She was neither grand nor secretive. She was practical and weary, and she carried with her the kind of knowledge that had been earned by years of mediation. In the chamber beneath the Sphinx, they found not a cinematic archive opened wide, but a careful array of crystalline cylinders, each sealed in frequency bands. The elder did not open them. She pressed her hands to the stone and played a sequence on a simple reed, a call that, in the projection, had been used to check resonance. The cylinders hummed a note that Dennis recognized as a modulated echo of the tone he had heard in the sarcophagus, a low, patient frequency that felt like a remembering. "The records wait," she told them. "They wait for communities that can read without harming." Her voice carried an old sadness. "They are not for every season." Dennis saw in that sadness the bracing of responsibility. He imagined a future where access was mishandled and where the fragile grace of threshold was turned into a carnival. He redoubled efforts with his community to teach restraint, to frame openings as services that required recovery and reintegration, and to collaborate with local stewards to ensure economic benefits did not corrode sacred care. It was impossible, even as he tried, to avoid the personal consequences of having been shown the afterlife in such immediacy. People wanted to know what it felt like to be free of death's old terror. He could describe his sensation: the dissolving ego, the reweaving of purpose, the quiet continuity of being. But he never promised the same outcomes for others. He repeated the alien's precautions: threshold, readiness, integration. He refused to become an evangelist for a single experience. He held to a simple ethic: tell the truth of witness, but do not turn witness into prescription. As the years thickened, Dennis found that his single life had become a kind of bridge.
He taught, tentatively, in small workshops about the ethics of sacred sites and the need for translation between ancient systems and modern institutions. He wrote a slim volume of memoir and careful speculation that he published with an academic press willing to include his caveats. It did not go viral. That, he learned to accept, was a blessing. The book found its readers slowly. A nurse who wrote that it had helped her with patience, an artist who said it unlocked a way of seeing, a graduate student who thanked him for insisting on the difference between testimony and claim. These small ripples were, in the end, the kind of dissemination the projection seemed to prefer. Dennis's inner life shifted in a way that surprised him. The old ache of being dismissed receded into a different shape, a quiet sorrow that now carried the fragrance of opportunity. He forgave certain colleagues, not because they had sought to harm, but because the human tendency to preserve one's career sometimes blurred into small cruelties. He forgave himself for the arrogance that had made him demand proof before understanding. He learned to hold both humility and conviction, an odd pair that felt like stitches in a new garment. He grew older with a kind of gentle urgency. He knew now that the threshold the projection had shown him was not a proprietary secret, but a test of stewardship across generations. The alien had said the Sphinx chamber would open when many hearts hold the note. Dennis began to imagine what it would take for a critical mass of hearts to hold such a note. Not uniform belief, but a culture hospitable to wonder without spectacle. A network that could bear both grief and joy, and a praxis of care that could scaffold people's returns. The final years of the tale were not marked by a single triumph, but by the slow accrual of small successes. The community formed by Dennis and his companions began hosting gatherings that focused on integration rather than spectacle. They worked with local custodians to create economic models that respected heritage and kept perverse incentives at bay. Students came to Dennis not to discover secrets, but to learn a discipline of listening. How to attend to stone, how to map voices that were not purely historical, and how to write with the humility that had once felt like defeat. Then, one evening, long after he had first been shown the projection, a small event occurred that felt to Dennis like confirmation, but not in the way a scholar craves confirmation. The elite seal beneath the Sphinx, the one that the projection had shown, did not crack dramatically with trumpets and honors. Instead, over the course of a season when the Nile ran high and the city was filled with people who came to tend and to rest, a small shift was reported by custodians. A cylinder that had hummed for generations at a certain pitch began to resonate in the presence of a particular group of visitors: children, elders, and those who had spent seasons in quiet practice. It was not an opening like a door blown off its hinges. It was a chime, a minor change in vibration that those who heard it described as the sound of a memory giving way to the present. Dennis stood miles away when reports filtered over the air. He did not rush. The projection had taught him not to be the kind of person who forced doors open. He allowed himself a private pleasure, a small smile like a man watching his garden finally bloom. He could not say that the Sphinx had revealed all its secrets, nor that this was proof of any cosmic plan. He only felt, intimately, that something had shifted. The threshold had thinned a little. The work of translation, of stewarding that thinness into accessible care, would continue. In the end, Dennis's life did not turn into a crusade nor into a spectacle. It became, quietly, a vocation of slow repair. He returned home more often than he had expected, and yet he traveled when asked. He taught the young archaeologist Hannah not just to measure stone, but to measure consequences. He wrote no manifestos, only careful guiding texts that emphasized consent, integration, and compassion. He continued to repeat, whenever asked about the alien and the projection, a short and honest phrase: "I saw, I was shown, I am witness, not proof." His community grew in modest circles across different countries. people who shared small practices of listening, of art, of care for those who returned from chambers changed. They wrote notes to each other, shared case studies with the privacy and dignity of a medical chart, and occasionally organized exhibitions that sought to translate experience into forms accessible to those who could not travel. Each gesture felt like a stitch. Toward the final arc of his life, Dennis returned to Egypt once more, aged but steady, to stand again at the rim of the sarcophagus he'd entered years before. He lay down, not as a seeker seeking initiation, but as someone who wanted to remember with clarity what responsibility meant. The projection had taught him much about death as recalibration, but it had most of all taught him about life after awakening. That those who returned to living bodies often held missions that were not grandiose but service-centered. His own mission, he had come to accept, was modest: to hold witness, to teach stewardship, to help create hospitable structures for integration. When he opened his eyes that last time in the chamber, he did not experience another dramatic vision. Instead, he felt a deep, affectionate review of his life. The tiny betrayals and the larger joys woven together into a pattern recognizably his. He saw the faces of the small community he had helped form, the hands that had held him, the students who had learned to listen with a care that might yet persist beyond him. He felt gratitude so powerful it resembled relief. The alien had shown him what happens after death, and the answer had been both simpler and stranger than he had expected. Death reframes purpose. Architecture and tone can assist passage. Initiation is not privilege but practice. Continuity is real. And the work of translation from ancient system to modern culture requires patient stewardship. Dennis had not been prepared for the enormity of that responsibility. He had not been ready for the humility it demanded. But being unprepared had become the doorway he needed. It had cracked him open to receptivity, and through that crack he had built a life of witness rather than triumph. In the months that followed, small rituals of remembrance took place. Lunches, quiet gatherings, a modest book published with a note explaining the difference between testimony and proof, and a slow, steady, ongoing project of training people in the ethics of threshold work. The aliens' final caution echoed in the work they carried forward. Interpret responsibly. Share with consent. Dennis's work did not end an era so much as it seeded a practice. People who had never before felt at home in the world found soft refuges in the communities he helped convene. Others remained skeptical, and Dennis accepted that as part of the weave. He had learned to regard doubt as a form of protection, not an enemy.
If you want to explore more of these eyewitness accounts and the careful translations that came from them, check the pinned comment for a link to the book and resources. And if this story touched something inside you, whether an echo of wonder, a prick of skepticism, or a memory you can't quite place, leave a comment. Have you ever felt like you belonged somewhere you've never been?